Find somewhere else to die." The words were spoken with a terrifying lack of emotion. Victoria stood in the foyer of our parents' home, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor that my father had polished every Sunday for 30 years. She did not look at the family photos on the mantel. She did not look at the urns. She looked at me. 3 days after the funeral, the air in the house still felt heavy with the scent of lilies and old books. Victoria held a stack of flattened cardboard boxes under her arm like they were a weapon. Behind her, her husband Derek leaned against the doorframe, checking his watch. He would not meet my eyes. He was wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly physical therapy sessions. I felt the familiar throb in my lower back, a sharp reminder of the metal rods holding my spine together. My hand tightened on the handle of my cherrywood cane. My knuckles were white, and my palm was beginning to sweat against the polished wood. I did not say anything at first. I could not. The air seemed to have left the room, leaving me gasping in a vacuum of my sister's making. I focused on a small scratch on the floorboards right near Victoria's left toe. I had made that scratch moving a heavy planter for my mother 6 months ago. Victoria did not wait for a response. She dropped the boxes. The hollow thud echoed through the silent house, a sound so final it felt like a gavel. She told me I had until Friday. She said the house was hers now. She said I was a burden that our parents were no longer around to carry. My sister, my own blood, looked at me as if I were a piece of furniture that no longer fit the aesthetic of the room. She saw the cane. She saw the slow way I moved. She saw a victim.my heartbeat was a frantic drum in my throat. I could feel the heat rising in my neck, but I kept my face still. I had spent 2 years learning how to control my body when it wanted to fail me. I could control my expression now. I watched her. I watched the way her eyes darted to the silver tea set on the sideboard. She was already mentally labeling the assets. She thought I was broken. She thought I was useless. She was wrong. I am Sierra Thompson. I am 34 years old, and for the last 2 years, I have been the ghost in this house. I was the daughter who stayed. I was the one who changed the bandages and managed the medications while Victoria sent thinking of you texts from her vacation home in the Hamptons. At 34, I should have been at the height of my career. Instead, I was fighting to keep my balance on a Tuesday morning while my sister tried to erase me. I have to ask you something. I need to know if you have ever been in this position. Have you ever been the one who did all the work, only to be pushed aside the moment things got difficult? Have you ever had a family member look at you and see a $sign instead of a human being? I would like to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from, and if you have ever had to find strength when you were at your lowest. It helps to know I am not the only one. And if these stories resonate with you, please consider subscribing. I would value your company. To understand the depth of Victoria's cruelty, you have to understand the height of what I lost. 2 years ago, my life was built on solid ground. I lived in a sun-drenched apartment in Hartford. I was a landscape architect. I did not just plant flowers. I designed ecosystems. I restored historic estates. I had a small firm with 3 employees and a reputation for being the best in the city. I had just signed a contract with the Botanical Society to redesign the public gardens. It was the biggest win of my career. Then the world turned upside down on a rainy Tuesday. I was driving home from a site visit. The light was green. I remember thinking about what I wanted for dinner. I remember the song on the radio, something soft and instrumental. I did not see the truck. I did not hear the brakes. There was only a sudden, violent shift in the universe. The sound of rending metal was louder than anything I had ever heard. The smell of the airbag was sharp and chemical. Then, there was nothing. I woke up 3 days later in a room that smelled of bleach and cold air. My parents were there. My mother was holding my hand so hard her fingers were purple. My father was staring out the window, his shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen. The doctor told me I had survived a high-speed impact with a drunk driver. He told me my spine had been shattered. He used words like permanent and limited mobility. He told me I might never walk again. The recovery was a slow descent into a different kind of life. My apartment had 3 flights of stairs. My firm could not run without me on the ground. The medical bills began to pile up, unread and overwhelming. When my parents offered me the guest room on the first floor of our childhood home, I did not have a choice. I said yes. I moved back into the room with my track trophies and my high school yearbooks. I felt like a failure at 32. For 18 months, I navigated the world from a wheelchair. I learned the specific humiliation of needing help to reach a glass in the kitchen. I learned how people look at you when you are at eye level with their belt buckles. My father built a wooden ramp over the back porch steps so I could go into the garden. My mother sat with me every afternoon, reading her mystery novels aloud while I stared at the roses I could no longer prune. Victoria called. She called once a month on a Sunday afternoon. She would talk for 20 minutes about her children's private school tuition or the trouble they were having with their landscaping in Greenwich. She never asked about my physical therapy. She never asked how the metal rods in my spine felt when the weather changed. If I was the one who picked up the phone, her voice would go flat. "Oh, Sierra. You are still there. Put Mom on, still there." As if I were a guest who had overstayed my welcome. As if I were a stain on the family's perfect reputation. She did not see the work I was doing. She did not see the hours of agonizing pain in the parallel bars at the clinic. She did not see the first time I stood up without help. She did not see the day I took 3 steps and collapsed into my father's arms, both of us crying. By the time my parents died in that plane crash over Nevada, I was walking with a cane. I was getting stronger. I was starting to look at job postings again. But to Victoria, I was still the broken thing in the guest room. She did not see a woman who had fought her way back from the edge of paralysis. She saw an obstacle. She saw $4 million worth of real estate that was being occupied by a useless sister. The last Christmas we spent together was the turning point. Victoria came home with Derek and their 2 children, Emma and Jack. They arrived in a black SUV that took up half the driveway. The kids ran through the house, leaving muddy footprints on the rugs I had spent the morning vacuuming. Victoria walked into the kitchen and immediately began critiquing the way my mother had set the table. "It is a bit cluttered, Mom," she said, moving the crystal water glasses. "We should try for something more modern this year." I was standing at the counter, propped up by my cane, making the chocolate chip pancakes Jack loved. My back was screaming. Every minute of standing felt like a hot needle was being pressed into my vertebrae. But I wanted to help. I wanted to be part of the family. I wanted to feel like I earned my place at the table. On Christmas morning, my father set up his old tripod for the family photo. It was a tradition. We would stand in front of the tree, the lights reflecting in the ornaments. My mother adjusted Jack's collar. Emma was holding a new doll. I moved toward the group, my cane clicking softly on the floor. Victoria looked at me. She did not look at my face, she looked at the cane. Then she looked at the camera. "Sierra, maybe you should sit this one out," she said. Her voice was light, as if she were suggesting a different flavor of tea. "We want a nice photo for the Christmas card. The cane, it does not really fit the aesthetic, you know." The room went silent. My mother looked at the floor. My father stared at the lens of the camera. I felt the heat in my cheeks, a burning shame that had nothing to do with my accident. I did not argue. I did not want to ruin the morning for my parents. I just nodded and walked into the kitchen. I stood by the window and watched through the glass as the shutter clicked. My family smiled. They looked perfect. They looked like the kind of people who did not have broken sisters. I did not know then that my father had watched me walk away. I did not know that the very next morning he drove to the city to see his lawyer. Victoria thought she had erased me from the picture. She did not realize she had just changed the entire story. The Tuesday that ended my world started with the scent of damp earth and the quiet hum of a house preparing for a journey. It was March, that fickle month where winter refuses to leave and spring is too timid to arrive. My parents were heading to California for an old college friend's wedding. They were excited in that quiet, understated way they had after 40 years of marriage. I remember my mother checking her reflection in the hallway mirror, tucking a loose strand of silver hair behind her ear, while my father checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. They were taking a private charter with 4 other passengers. I stood on the porch and watched their car pull out of the driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires like breaking glass. I didn't know it was the last time I would see them whole. I spent the afternoon in the garden, pruning the roses my mother had planted 15 years ago. The air was cold enough to bite at my fingers through my gardening gloves, but the physical labor felt good. It made me feel like something other than a patient, something other than a woman with metal rods in her back. I was focused on a stubborn, thorny branch when the phone rang in my pocket. The sound was sharp and intrusive. I answered it, expecting my mother to tell me they had landed safely in the sunshine. Instead, the voice on the other end was formal, hollow, and devastatingly efficient. The plane had gone down somewhere over Nevada. Mechanical failure. They said it was quick. I stood there among the dormant rose bushes, the shears still clutched in my hand, and felt the entire world collapse into the dirt at my feet. My life became a series of blurred, disconnected frames. Victoria flew in the next day, and for the first time in my life, she didn't just take the lead, she took the entire stage. She handled the arrangements, the flowers, the guest list, everything. I was too numb to fight her, too caught in the heavy, suffocating fog of grief to care that I was being sidelined in my own tragedy. At the service, I sat in the front pew, my cane balanced against my knee, and realized with a jolt of cold clarity that I didn't recognize half the people filling the chapel. They were Victoria's friends, her business contacts, people who had never stepped foot in my parents' home but wanted to be seen offering condolences to a woman they considered a social asset. I felt like a ghost at my own parents' funeral. I watched her greet mourners with a practiced, tragic grace that made my skin crawl. She looked perfect in her designer black wool coat. She didn't look like a daughter who had barely called her mother in months. She looked like the star of a movie I hadn't auditioned 4.3 days after we buried them. The performance ended. The mask didn't just slip, it was hurled aside. Victoria found me in the living room, surrounded by piles of sympathy cards I couldn't bring myself to open. She didn't sit down. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, her husband Derek hovering behind her like a pale, nervous shadow. She told me she had spoken with the lawyer. She said that everything, the house, the accounts, the legacy, went to her. I looked up at her, my heart hammering a frantic, sickly rhythm against my ribs. I asked her which lawyer. She waved her hand as if swatting away a persistent fly. The lawyer. Mom and Dad's estate attorney. He confirmed it. I watched her face. Her eye gave a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch. My parents had used Harold Whitmore for over 20 years. If Victoria had actually spoken to him, she would have used his name. She would have called him Harold. Something cold and sharp settled in my stomach. She was bluffing, but she didn't stop there. She told me I had 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live. 2 weeks to pack up 34 years of a life and disappear. That night, the silence of the house was heavy enough to crush the lungs. I sat in my father's study and tried to map out a future that simply did not exist. I had no job. I'd been forced to close my firm 18 months ago when the medical bills started eating my life. I had no savings. Every penny had been drained by copays, specialists, and the endless parade of prescriptions that kept my spine from seizing into a permanent knot of agony. My disability payments barely covered the basics. And now, according to my sister, I no longer had a home. I looked at my father's desk, the oak worn smooth by 40 years of his hands. I looked at my mother's reading chair, the fabric faded where she used to rest her head while she read to me on my darkest days. This house wasn't just an asset. It was where I took my first steps. It was where my father taught me how to argue and my mother taught me how to cook. Every room held a ghost, and every corner held a piece of them. If I walked away now, I wasn't just losing a roof, I was losing them all over again. I wouldn't let her do it. I wouldn't accept that I was useless. I started opening drawers, my fingers trembling with a mixture of grief and a growing, white-hot fury. I moved through old tax returns and faded photographs, searching for any scrap of proof that Victoria was lying. In the very bottom drawer of the desk, tucked beneath a stack of mundane documents, I found a business card. Harold Whitmore, estate attorney. I flipped it over. On the back, in my father's precise, careful handwriting, were 6 words that stopped my breath. Call him. He knows everything. My father never wrote notes like that. Never. He had known. He had seen the way the wind was blowing long before the storm hit. I gripped the card until the edges bit into my skin. Victoria thought she had won because I was the one with the cane. She thought I was a broken woman with nowhere to go. She was dead wrong. I stared at the small white card until the name Harold Whitmore began to blur. My father was a man of few words, but every word he did speak was weighted with intent. He didn't leave cryptic notes. He didn't believe in games. If he had hidden this card where only someone looking through his private records would find it, it was because he knew Victoria would be the first one to storm the castle. He knew her better than I did. I had spent years trying to see the sisterly bond that wasn't there, while he had spent those same years watching her character sharpen into a blade. The house felt colder now, as if the walls were beginning to pull away from me. I sat in the leather chair that still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco and the old, expensive paper he used for his correspondence. I picked up the heavy desk phone. My thumb hovered over the keypad. I could hear Victoria in the hallway upstairs. She was laughing. It was a sharp, high-pitched sound that didn't belong in a house of mourning. She was talking to someone on her cell phone about backsplash tile and open-concept floor plans. She was already gutting our parents' history before their bodies were even cold. I dialed the number. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in the cage of my ribs. The ringing tone seemed to echo through the entire house, vibrating in the marrow of my bones. Whitmore and Associates, a woman's voice said. She sounded like she was speaking from a place where everything was orderly and governed by law. I need to speak with Harold, I said. I had to clear my throat. My voice was a thin, raspy thing. This is Sierra Thompson. There was a pause. A long, heavy silence that made the hair on my arm stand up. Then, the line clicked. Sierra. Harold's voice was deep, a resonant baritone that immediately settled some of the static in my brain. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded relieved. I've been waiting for this call. I looked at the card in my hand. He knows everything. My father's handwriting seemed to pulse. I need to see you, Harold. Victoria is. She says she's already talked to you. She says everything is hers. Harold didn't skip a beat. I haven't spoken to your sister in 6 months, Sierra. Not since the day your father and I finalized the new directives. We need to meet. 3 days from now. Friday morning at 10. Bring your ID and the key to the safety deposit box if you have it. I told him I would be there. When I hung up, I didn't feel the rush of relief I expected. I felt a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was a witness. The next 48 hours were a marathon of psychological warfare. Victoria didn't just ignore me. She began to erase me. On Wednesday afternoon, I came out of my room to find the movers. They weren't moving things in. They were taking things out. 2 men in gray jumpsuits were wrapping my mother's collection of antique blue willow china in bubble wrap. What are you doing? I asked. I had to lean heavily on my cane. The sudden movement had sent a flare of pain through my lower back, but I refused to wince. Victoria appeared from the dining room, a clipboard in her hand. She looked like a CEO conducting a hostile takeover. I'm clearing out the clutter, Sierra. We're going to list the house by the end of the month. The realtor says it needs to be neutralized. She was talking about my mother's life. That china had been used for every Thanksgiving I could remember. I remembered the way my mother would carefully hand-wash each piece, her wedding ring clinking against the porcelain. It was a sound of safety. Now it was being stuffed into boxes. You can't do this, I said. My voice was steady, but my hand was gripping the cane so hard my knuckles were white. The will hasn't even been read yet. Victoria laughed. It was a short, dry sound. Sierra, let's be realistic. Dad always said I was the one with the head for business. You're you. You haven't worked in 2 years. You live on their charity. Why would they leave a $4 million estate to someone who can't even take care of herself? Derek and I have the kids to think about. We need the liquidity. She walked past me, the scent of her expensive perfume trailing behind her like a poisonous cloud. She didn't see the woman who had spent the last year relearning how to tie her own shoes. She didn't see the woman who had managed their medications and coordinated their doctors. She only saw the cane. The injustice of it felt like a physical weight. It triggered a memory from my childhood, one I hadn't thought about in decades. I was 8 and Victoria was 12. I had spent weeks building a fairy garden in the woods behind our house. I had used moss, twigs, and smooth river stones. It was my secret world. Victoria had found it one afternoon. She didn't say anything. She just walked through the center of it, grinding the moss into the dirt with her sneakers. When I cried, she told me I was being dramatic. She told me it was just dirt. She was still walking through my gardens. Thursday was worse. Derek started measuring the walls in the guest room. While I was still in bed, he didn't knock. He just walked in with a metal tape measure that snapped like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Sorry, Sierra," he said, though he didn't look sorry at all. "We're thinking of turning this into a home gym. You'll need to have your things out by Friday night." Victoria was serious about that deadline. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I just watched him. I noticed the way he avoided looking at the shelf where I kept my physical therapy equipment. He was uncomfortable with my brokenness. He wanted it gone so he didn't have to feel the flicker of guilt that came with being a predator. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window and watched the moon rise over the garden. I thought about the Christmas photo. I thought about the look on my father's face when Victoria told me I didn't fit the aesthetic. He hadn't said anything then. He had been a man of quiet observations. He had seen his eldest daughter's cruelty, and he had seen his youngest daughter's dignity. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass. I looked tired. There were shadows under my eyes that hadn't been there before the crash. But there was something else too. A hardness in my jaw. A clarity in my gaze. I wasn't the girl who let her fairy garden be crushed anymore. Friday morning arrived with a gray, dismal sky. I dressed in the best suit I had left, a charcoal gray power suit from my days as an architect. It was a bit loose now, but it still had the sharp lines of a woman who knew how to command a room. I spent extra time on my hair and makeup. I wanted to look like the professional I used to be. I wanted to look like someone who was ready for a fight. Victoria was waiting in the foyer. She was wearing a cream-colored dress that looked like it cost a year of my physical therapy. She looked at my suit and smirked. "Dressing up for the eviction?" she asked. "That's a bit much, don't you think?" I didn't answer. I just walked past her and out to the car. We drove to Harold's office in a suffocating silence. Derek drove, his hands tight on the wheel. Victoria sat in the passenger seat, tapping a rhythm on her designer handbag. I sat in the back, my cane resting against my leg like a scepter. When we arrived at the law firm, the building was all glass and steel, a monument to the permanence of rules. We were led into a conference room with a long mahogany table. Harold was already there. He stood up when I entered. He didn't look at Victoria first. He looked at me. "Sierra," he said, his voice warm. "It's good to see you standing." Victoria cleared her throat, her irritation visible in the sharp set of her shoulders. "Can we get on with this, Harold? We have a lot to do today." "I've already started the process of prepping the house for sale." Harold sat back down. He opened a thick leather folder. His movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of the urgency Victoria was trying to project. "Actually, Victoria," he said, looking at her over the top of his reading glasses, "we aren't here to discuss the sale of the house. We are here to discuss the final wishes of Thomas and Martha Thompson." Victoria leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Right. Which means the house and the accounts coming to me. I'm the executor. I'm the primary beneficiary." Let's just sign the papers. Harold didn't pick up a pen. Instead, he pulled out a document with a gold seal at the bottom. He looked at Victoria, then at Derek, and finally at me. There was a significant change made to your parents' estate plan 3 months ago, Harold said. The room went very, very still. Your father came to see me specifically to address the future of the family legacy. He felt that the previous arrangement no longer reflected the reality of this family. Victoria's face went pale. What are you talking about? What change? Harold turned the document so we could all see it. He pointed to a paragraph near the middle of the page. The bulk of the estate, including the primary residence, the investment portfolio, and the family's liquid assets, totaling approximately $28 million, has been placed into a restrictive trust. Victoria let out a breath she seemed to have been holding. Fine. A trust. I can manage a trust. Harold held up a hand. You misunderstand, Victoria. You are not the trustee. And you are not the primary beneficiary. He turned his gaze to me. Sierra, your father was very clear. He felt that you were the only one who truly understood the value of what he and your mother built. He wanted to ensure that the person who cared for them in their final years was the one who was cared for in return. I felt a lump form in my throat, a mixture of grief and a sudden, overwhelming sense of being seen. What? Victoria shrieked. The sound was like glass shattering. That's impossible. She's a cripple. She can't even walk without that stick. You're telling me he left $28 million to her? Harold's voice went cold. Cold enough to freeze the air in the room. He left it to the daughter who stayed, Victoria. He left it to the woman who showed him that strength isn't about how fast you walk, but where you choose to stand. I looked at my sister. Her face was contorted with a rage so pure it was almost unrecognizable. She looked like she wanted to reach across the table and tear the paper from Harold's hands. But Harold wasn't finished. There is one more thing, he said. And this is the part your father wanted me to emphasize. The trust has a very specific clause regarding the house. I held my breath. I could feel the weight of my father's gaze from beyond the grave. Sierra has total discretion over the property, Harold said. And your father's instructions were very clear. If Victoria attempts to challenge this will or disrupts the peace of the household, she is to be barred from the premises immediately. He looked at Victoria, his eyes hard. That Friday deadline you mentioned earlier? It seems the roles have been reversed. I looked at my sister. I looked at the woman who had told me to find somewhere else to die. I didn't feel the triumph I thought I would. I just felt a profound, quiet sadness. She had traded her family for a bank account she was never going to touch. I leaned forward, my hands resting on the table. Victoria, I said. My voice was calm. It was cinematic. It was the voice of the woman I was becoming. I think it's time you went home. And by that, I mean your house in Greenwich. Not mine. I watched the realization sink in. I watched the power shift. I wasn't the ghost in the house anymore. I was the master of it. The silence in the conference room was brittle, a thin sheet of ice stretched over a dark and bottomless lake. Victoria's mouth was open, but no sound came out for several seconds. She looked like a person who had walked confidently into a glass door she hadn't seen. Her eyes darted from Harold's face to the document on the table and finally to me. She was searching for a crack, a flaw, a hint that this was all an elaborate and cruel joke orchestrated by a sister she despised. I watched a single bead of sweat roll down Derek's temple, disappearing into the collar of his expensive shirt. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. He looked small. This is a lie, Victoria finally whispered. Her voice was low and dangerous, vibrating with a frequency that made the water in the glass in front of her tremble. You've forged this. Sierra couldn't have done this on her own. She's been drugged up. On painkillers and physical therapy for 2 years. She's not even coherent half the time. Harold, I will have your license for this. I will sue this firm into the ground. Harold did not blink. He did not shift in his chair. He had the calm, immovable presence of an oak tree in a hurricane. He had seen people like Victoria before, people who thought their will was the only law that mattered. He reached into his folder and pulled out a tablet, tapping the screen a few times before sliding it across the polished mahogany table toward my sister. "Your father anticipated this reaction, Victoria," Harold said. "He recorded a video statement the day he signed these papers. I suggest you watch it before you make any more threats that will only complicate your legal standing." I watched Victoria's face as the video began to play. I didn't need to see the screen to know what was on it. I could hear my father's voice, clear and steady, filling the room. It was the voice that had tucked me in at night and the voice that had told me I would walk again when the doctors were doubtful. He sounded tired, but there was a steel in his tone that I hadn't heard in years. He spoke directly to the camera, addressing both of his daughters. He spoke about the value of a home not as a piece of property, but as a sanctuary. He spoke about the disappointment of watching one child treat her family like a business transaction. He mentioned the Christmas photo. He mentioned the way I had been treated as an inconvenience. Victoria's hand began to shake. The tablet rattled against the table. She looked as if she had been slapped. The video ended with my father's final instruction: "Sierra is the heart of this family. She stays." The room remained silent long after the screen went black. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of a siren on the street below. I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. $28 million. It was a number so large it felt abstract, like a distance in light years. It didn't feel like wealth. It felt like a shield. It felt like my father had reached out from the past to wrap his arms around me and tell me I was safe. I thought about the time I was 12 and Victoria had convinced me to climb the old oak tree in the backyard, promising she would catch me if I slipped. I had climbed higher than I ever had, feeling the rough bark beneath my fingers and the wind in my hair. When I finally lost my footing, I looked down to see her. Walking away toward the house, her back turned. I had fallen 10 feet, bruising my ribs and scraping the skin off my palms. When I crawled back to the porch, crying and bleeding, she told our parents I had been reckless and that she had tried to stop me. She had looked at me with that same cold, detached expression she was wearing now. She had always been the architect of my falls, but this time, the ground had risen up to meet me. Victoria looked at me then, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in her eyes. It wasn't the fear of losing me or the fear of her own grief. It was the fear of a predator who had suddenly realized the cage door was locked from the outside. She realized that the woman she had planned to discard now held her entire lifestyle in the palm of her hand. The Greenwich house, the private schools, the social standing, all of it was tied to the family estate that I now controlled. "Sierra, listen," she started, her voice shifting into a tone of forced reason. "We were all under a lot of stress. I didn't mean those things I said at the house. I was just trying to be practical. You have to understand that maintaining a property like that is a huge responsibility. I was trying to protect you." I felt a cold laugh bubble up in my throat, but I kept it down. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I thought about the boxes she had brought to the house. I thought about the movers wrapping my mother's china. I thought about the way she had told me to find somewhere else to die. "You were protecting yourself, Victoria," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. "You saw an opportunity to erase the parts of this family that didn't fit your aesthetic. You thought I was a ghost." I stood up. The effort sent a sharp, familiar tug through my lower back, but I stood tall. I leaned on my cane, but I didn't feel weak. I felt like a pillar. I looked at Derek, who was staring at his shoes, and then back at my sister. "Harold mentioned a deadline," I said. "I think you said Friday?" "Well, it's Friday morning. You have until sunset to remove your things from my house. And I want the blue willow china unpacked and put back in the sideboard before you leave." Victoria stood up so quickly her chair nearly toppled. "You can't do this. You can't just kick us out. We have children." I looked at her, my expression unmoving. "You were going to do the same to me. And I don't have a husband or a second home in Greenwich. I would have been on the street." I turned to Harold and thanked him for his time. I didn't wait for Victoria to respond. I walked out of the conference room, the rhythmic click-thud of my cane on the marble floor sounding like a countdown. I felt the weight of her gaze on my back, a hot, prickling sensation of pure hatred. It didn't bother me. I had lived in the cold for 2 years. A little heat was a welcome change. The ride back to the house was the longest 30 minutes of my life. Derek drove in a stunned, robotic silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Victoria sat in the back with me, staring out the window. She didn't speak a word. The air in the car was thick with the scent of her expensive perfume and the suffocating tension of 1,000 unspoken accusations. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked different. The sun was breaking through the gray clouds, catching the glass of the windows and making them sparkle like diamonds. It wasn't just a building anymore. It wasn't a burden or a memory. It was mine. It was a fortress. The movers were still there, carrying a heavy trunk toward their truck. I rolled down the window as we passed them. "Stop," I said. The men paused, looking confused. Victoria leaned forward, her face flushed. "Ignore her. Keep working." I looked at the lead mover, a tall man with a kind face who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "I am the owner of this property," I told him, holding up the legal documents Harold had given me. "This move is canceled. Everything that has been taken out of the house needs to be brought back in immediately." The man looked at Victoria, then at the papers in my hand, and finally at Derek. Derek just nodded slowly, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The mover tipped his hat to me and began barking orders to his crew. I got out of the car and walked up the front steps. For the first time since the accident, I didn't count the stairs. I didn't think about the pain. I just thought about the feeling of the key in the lock. I opened the door and stepped into the foyer. The house smelled of dust and roses. It felt like home. Victoria followed me inside, her heels clicking aggressively on the hardwood. "Sierra, we need to talk about this. We can work something out. I can help you manage the trust. You don't know anything about high-level finance. You'll lose it all in a year." I turned to face her. I didn't say a word. I just pointed to the stairs. "Start packing, Victoria," I said. I watched her face crumble. The mask of the sophisticated, high-powered woman finally disintegrated, leaving behind the scared, greedy girl she had always been. She realized that for the first time in her life, she couldn't charm or bully her way out of a situation. She had played her hand, and she had lost. I walked into the kitchen and put the kettle on. I needed a cup of tea. I needed to sit in my mother's chair and listen to the house breathe. As the water began to hum, I looked out the window at the garden. The roses were still there, waiting for the spring. I was still here, too. I was no longer the daughter who stayed. I was the daughter who survived. The steam from the kettle rose in a lazy, swirling column, catching the afternoon light that slanted through the kitchen window. I watched it for a long time, my hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that had belonged to my mother. The warmth seeped into my palms, a stark contrast to the icy chill that had settled in my bones during the meeting at Harold's office. Upstairs, the house was screaming. Not with voices, but with the violent sounds of a life being dismantled in haste. I heard the heavy thud of suitcases being dragged across the floorboards. I heard the sharp, rhythmic snap of dresser drawers being opened and slammed shut. Every sound felt like a victory, yet every sound felt like a new bruise. Victoria was not a quiet loser. I could hear her sharp, jagged voice echoing through the vents as she argued with Derek. She was blaming him for not checking the paperwork. She was blaming our father for being a senile old man. She was blaming the world for not bowing to her desires. I sat at the small oak table where I had eaten breakfast every morning for the last 2 years and simply breathed. The silence of the kitchen was a sanctuary, a small pocket of peace in a house that was currently purging its toxins. I looked at the counter where the movers had left several half-packed boxes. My mother's blue willow china was peeking out from a nest of crumpled newspaper. I stood up, my back giving a sharp, warning twinge, and moved toward them. I didn't use my cane for the 3 steps it took to reach the counter. I wanted to feel the weight of my own body, even the pain of it. I reached into the box and pulled out a dinner plate. The intricate blue pattern of the willows and the bridge felt smooth and familiar under my thumb. It was a small thing. A piece of clay and glaze. But to Victoria, it was an asset to be liquidated. To me, it was the memory of my mother's hands. I remembered a Saturday 10 years ago. I had come home from college for a weekend visit, and my mother was setting the table for a small dinner party. I had accidentally bumped into the sideboard, sending one of the teacups from this set tumbling to the floor. It had shattered into a dozen jagged pieces. I had been horrified, already apologizing, expecting the kind of sharp reprimand Victoria would have delivered. But my mother had just knelt down with a dustpan and smiled at me. "Sierra," she had said, "things are just things. They can be replaced. People are what matter. Don't ever let a broken object break your spirit." Victoria had been standing in the doorway then, too. She had looked at the broken porcelain and then at me with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. She told me I was clumsy. She told me I was a liability. She had spent the rest of the evening making sure our guests knew that the set was now incomplete because of my carelessness. She didn't care about the cup. She cared about the flaw in the perfection. She cared about the power she could extract from my mistake. I took the plates out of the box one by one. I walked them over to the sideboard and began to arrange them back in their rightful places. The clink of the porcelain against the wood was the only sound in the room. It was a slow, meditative process. With every plate I returned, I felt a little more of the house coming back to life. I was reclaiming the space. I was healing the fractures Victoria had tried to create. The thumping upstairs stopped. I heard the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs. I didn't turn around. I kept my back to the door, focusing on the alignment of the serving platter. I heard Victoria's heels click on the linoleum. The scent of her perfume arrived first, something sharp and expensive that always made my throat feel tight. "Is this what you wanted?" she asked. Her voice was brittle, like dry leaves. "To see us like this? To humiliate your own sister?" I turned slowly, leaning against the counter for support. Victoria stood in the center of the kitchen, flanked by Derek, who was carrying 2 bulging garment bags. She looked smaller than she had this morning. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and the perfect cream dress was wrinkled at the waist. She looked like a woman who had finally realized the ground wasn't where she thought it was. "I didn't want any of this, Victoria," I said. "I wanted my parents to be alive. I wanted to be able to walk without a cane. I wanted a sister who didn't look at me like I was a problem to be solved." She scoffed, a short, ugly sound. "You're so sanctimonious. You think you're better than me because you stayed here and played nursemaid. You were just hiding, Sierra. You were too scared to go back out into the real world, so you clung to mom and dad like a parasite. And now you've tricked them into giving you everything." The word parasite hit me like a physical blow. I felt my heart rate spike, a frantic drumming in my ears. I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles turning white. I thought about the nights I had sat up with my father when his cough wouldn't stop. I thought about the hours I had spent researching experimental treatments for my mother's heart condition. I thought about the way I had pushed through the agony of my own physical therapy just so I could be strong enough to help them down the porch steps. "I wasn't hiding," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt louder than a scream. "I was loving them. Something you wouldn't know anything about." Derek cleared his throat, shifting the weight of the bags. "Victoria, let's just go. We have the car packed. The kids are waiting at the hotel." Victoria ignored him. She took a step toward me, her eyes narrowed into slits. "You think you've won. But look at you. You're 34 years old, you're alone in this big, empty tomb of a house, and you can barely stand up straight. You have $20 million and no one to share it with. Enjoy your money, Sierra. I hope it keeps you warm at night when you realize that I'm the only family you have left, and I'm never coming back." She turned on her heel and walked out. I heard the front door open, the heavy oak groan on its hinges, and then the final, definitive slam. The sound vibrated through the floorboards and up into the soles of my feet. It was over. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after the sound of their car faded away. The silence was absolute. It was the kind of silence that usually feels lonely, but today it felt like a deep, cleansing breath. I walked over to the sink and turned on the tap, letting the cool water run over my hands. I looked out the window at the garden. The shadows were lengthening, stretching across the lawn toward the woods. I was alone. Victoria was right about that. My parents were gone, and my sister had just severed the last thread of our connection with a serrated edge. I was a 34-year-old woman with a broken back and a bank account that felt like a surreal dream. I walked into the living room and sat down in my mother's favorite armchair. It was velvet, a deep forest green, and it still held the faint scent of her lavender sachets. I let my cane fall to the floor. It clattered against the rug, a sound of surrender. I closed my eyes and let the weight of the day settle over me. I thought about the money. $28 million. It was an impossible sum. It was enough to rebuild my firm 10 times over. It was enough to fund 100 scholarships for students who had lost everything in accidents. It was enough to ensure that this house remained a sanctuary for as long as I lived. But more than that, it was a message. My father hadn't just left me money. He had left me his trust. He had looked at the daughter who had been told she was useless, and he had said, "No. You are the one I rely on." I felt a tear slip down my cheek, followed by another. I didn't try to stop them. They weren't tears of grief, not entirely. They were tears of release. For 2 years, I had been holding my breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the moment when my fragility would finally break me. I had spent every day proving to the world that I was still here, still capable, still worth something, and now I didn't have to prove it anymore. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a foundation. I looked at the fireplace, the stones soot-stained and ancient. I looked at the built-in bookshelves filled with my father's histories and my mother's mysteries. This was where I belonged. I stayed in that chair until the sun went down and the room was swallowed by shadows. I didn't turn on the lights. I wanted to sit in the dark and listen to the house. I heard the occasional creak of the floorboards as the temperature dropped. I heard the wind whispering through the eaves. It was a peaceful sound. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed on the side table. It was a text from Harold. "Just checking in, Sierra. I hope the afternoon went as smoothly as possible. Let me know if you need anything. We'll start the formal transfer of the trust assets on Monday." I didn't reply right away. I looked at the screen, the blue light harsh in the darkened room. Monday. A new week. A new life. I stood up, moving slowly and carefully. My back was stiff, a dull ache that I knew would never truly go away. I picked up my cane and walked toward the stairs. I had spent 2 years in the guest room on the first floor because the stairs were a mountain I wasn't ready to climb. I had avoided the second floor, the hallway where my parents' bedroom was, the rooms that held the most memories. I stood at the bottom of the staircase and looked up. The stairs were carpeted in a soft, cream-colored wool. The mahogany railing was polished to a high shine. I took a breath. I gripped the railing with my left hand and tucked my cane under my right arm. I took the first step. It was hard. The muscles in my legs protested, and a sharp jolt of electricity shot through my spine. I paused, closed my eyes, and waited for the pain to subside. I didn't turn back. I took the second step. Then the third. I climbed the stairs one by one, a slow and agonizing ascent. By the time I reached the landing, I was shaking and my forehead was slick with sweat. But I was there. I was on the second floor. I walked down the hallway, my cane clicking on the floor. I passed Victoria's old room. The door was open, and I could see the bare mattress and the empty shelves. It looked cold. I passed my old room, the one I hadn't slept in since the accident. It was still filled with the remnants of my former life, the architecture books, the drafting table, the photos of my friends in Hartford. Finally, I reached the door at the end of the hall. My parents' room. I hesitated, my hand on the glass doorknob. This was the heart of the house. This was the place that had always been off limits to me during my recovery, a sacred space I hadn't felt worthy of entering. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was exactly as they had left it. The bed was made, the pillows fluffed. My father's slippers were tucked under the edge of the dust ruffle. My mother's jewelry box sat on the vanity, a silver hairbrush resting beside it. The air smelled of them, the cedar of his cologne and the rosewater of hers. I walked to the window and looked out. From this height, I could see the entire property. I could see the silhouette of the old oak tree, the one I had fallen from all those years ago. I could see the outline of the garden and the fence that marked the edge of our land. I wasn't a ghost. I wasn't a liability. I was Sierra Thompson, and I was home. I sat down on the edge of the bed and felt the weight of the day finally, fully descend. I was tired. I was in pain. But for the first time in 2 years, I was safe. I reached out and touched the silver hairbrush, the metal cool against my skin. You were right, Dad, I whispered into the empty room. She didn't understand. I lay back on the bed, not even bother to take off my shoes. I was too exhausted to move another inch. I stared up at the ceiling, watching the moonlight dance in the shadows. I felt the house wrapped around me like a blanket. I closed my eyes and, for the first time in a very long time, I slept without dreaming of falling. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was streaming into the room, bright and unapologetic. I sat up, feeling the familiar stiffness in my limbs, but there was a new lightness in my heart. I had survived the first night. I went downstairs and made a pot of coffee. I sat on the back porch, watching the birds flutter around the feeder. The air was crisp, the kind of morning that promised a change in the season. I thought about the work that needed to be done. The garden needed attention. The house needed to be cleaned of Victoria's presence. The trust needed to be managed, but there was no rush. I had all the time in the world. I thought about the comments Victoria had made. About me being alone. About the house being a tomb. She didn't realize that being alone wasn't the same as being lonely. I had my memories. I had my strength. And I had a future that was entirely my own. I picked up my phone and called my old business partner, Sarah. I hadn't spoken to her in months, too ashamed of my situation to reach out. The phone rang 3 times before she picked up. Sierra? She asked, her voice filled with surprise. Hey, Sarah, I said, watching a blue jay land on the birdbath. I've been thinking about that public garden project. The one we had to pass on 2 years ago. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sierra, that was a long time ago. We've moved on. I know, I said. But I'm thinking about starting something new. Something bigger. I have some resources now. I spent the next hour talking to her, the words flowing out of me like a river that had finally broken through a dam. I talked about designs and ecosystems and restoration. I talked about a vision for the city that went beyond just planting flowers. I felt the spark of my old self igniting, a flame that I thought had been extinguished for good. When I hung up, I felt a surge of energy that I hadn't felt since before the accident. I wasn't just surviving. I was beginning to live. I stood up and walked into the garden. I left my cane on the porch. I took a few steps, my feet finding their rhythm on the grass. It wasn't perfect. I was slow and my gait was uneven. But I was walking. I reached the rose bushes and knelt down. I looked at the dormant branches, the tiny buds just starting to show. They had survived the winter. They had endured the cold and the ice and the dark. And soon, they would bloom. I reached out and touched a thorn, feeling the sharp prick against my finger. It was a reminder that even beautiful things had defenses. Even the most delicate flower could protect itself. I wasn't the fairy garden that could be crushed under a sneaker anymore. I was the rose bush. I was deep-rooted. I was resilient. And I was just getting started. I spent the rest of the day in the garden, working until my back was screaming and my hands were stained with earth. I didn't care. The pain was a small price to pay for the feeling of purpose. I was building something. I was restoring the legacy my parents had left me. As the sun began to set, I walked back to the house. I stopped on the porch and looked back at the garden. It looked different now. It looked like a beginning. I went inside and closed the door. The house was quiet, but it was a warm, living silence. I was home. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was. I was Sierra Thompson. And I was standing my ground. The first Monday of my new life arrived with a clarity that was almost violent. I woke up in my parents' bed, the sun hitting the silver hairbrush on the vanity and casting a sharp, metallic glint across the ceiling. For a moment, the old weight was there, the phantom pain in my lower back, the instinct to check the clock for my mother's medication schedule. Then, the silence of the house settled over me. It was a heavy, expensive silence. I was alone, but for the first time in 2 years, the walls didn't feel like they were closing in. They felt like they were holding me up. I spent the morning in my father's study. I sat in his leather chair, the one that still held the faint indentation of his frame, and opened the black lacquered laptop he had used for his investments. The password was my mother's maiden name. It felt like a secret handshake from the grave. When the screen flickered to life, the numbers in the trust accounts appeared in a jagged landscape of zeros. $28 million. It was a number that didn't feel like money, it felt like power. It was the ability to say no. It was the ability to never have to explain the click of my cane ever again. The phone rang at 10 o'clock. It was Harold Whitmore. He wanted to finalize the transfer of the liquid assets and discuss the management fees for the trust. I told him I'd be at his office by noon. The drive into the city felt different. I wasn't the broken daughter being chauffeured to a funeral or a doctor's appointment. I was a client. I parked the car, my mother's silver sedan, and walked toward the glass towers of the financial district. The smell of the city was a cocktail of exhaust fumes, burnt coffee from the sidewalk carts, and the cold, metallic scent of rain on asphalt. I liked it. It smelled like movement. In Harold's office, the air was conditioned to a perfect, sterile coolness. He had a stack of documents waiting for me, each one requiring a signature that felt like a nail in the coffin of my old life. We talked about diversifying the portfolio. We talked about tax implications. We talked about the house. Sierra, your father was very specific about the maintenance budget, Harold said, sliding a ledger across the desk. He wanted to make sure you never had to worry about a leaking roof or a gardener again. The house is a fortress, and he's provided the garrison. I looked at the line items. The numbers were staggering. He had planned for everything. He had seen the way Victoria looked at the property, not as a home, but as a hurdle to be cleared. Whenever I thought of Victoria's greed, a specific memory surfaced like oil on water. I was 22, home from college for the summer. Our mother had a delicate gold locket, a gift from my father on their 20th anniversary. It disappeared one afternoon. Victoria had been the last one in the bedroom. When my mother asked about it, Victoria didn't just deny taking it. She told my mother that I had mentioned wanting to sell some old jewelry to pay for my study abroad trip. She stood there, her face a mask of sisterly concern, while my mother looked at me with a confusion that felt like a physical weight. I had spent 3 days in a state of silent, shaking fury before I found the locket tucked into the back of Victoria's underwear drawer. When I confronted her, she didn't apologize. She told me I was lucky she hadn't called the police. She had always been a thief of reputation. Now, she was just a thief who had been caught. After the meeting with Harold, I drove to a small cafe in the South End to meet Sarah. I hadn't seen her in person since the accident. I saw her before she saw me. She was sitting at a corner table, her laptop open, her brow furrowed in that way she always did when she was calculating a grade. She looked exactly the same. The same messy bun. The same oversized glasses. The same energy that always made me feel like I was moving too slow. I walked toward her, my cane clicking on the checkered tile floor. She looked up, and for a split second, I saw it, the flash of pity. The look people give you when they don't know where to put their eyes. It lasted half a heartbeat before she replaced it with a wide, genuine smile. Sierra, she said, standing up to hug me. You look like you. I sat down, the movement causing a sharp, familiar tug in my spine. I ignored it. I looked like me, but with a different set of armor. We ordered sandwiches we didn't eat and coffee that went cold as I told her about the trust. I didn't tell her the exact number. I didn't have to. She saw it in the way I held myself. I want to reopen the firm, Sarah, I said. I watched her eyes widen. But not the way it was. I don't want to do suburban backyard patios and corporate entryways. I want to do the restoration work. I want to buy the land that the developers are trying to pave over. I want to build things that last. Sarah leaned back, her hands around her mug. That takes a lot of capital, Sierra. Developers have deep pockets. I have deeper ones, I said. The conversation shifted then. We weren't just two old friends catching up. We were two architects plotting a coup. We talked about the Botanical Society project. We talked about the old textile mill on the river that had been abandoned for 30 years. I felt the old spark in my chest, a heat that had nothing to do with anger or grief. It was the feeling of a blueprint coming together. I walked out of the cafe 2 hours later feeling like I could fly. The city didn't feel like a threat anymore. It felt like a canvas. I stood on the sidewalk and watched the people rushing past, their lives a blur of motion. I was the still point in the center of the chaos. When I got back to the house, the sun was beginning to dip below the tree line. I walked into the foyer and saw a stack of mail on the side table. Most of it was junk, catalogs for my mother, credit card offers for my father. But at the bottom of the pile was a thick, ivory envelope with Victoria's handwriting. I didn't open it. Not yet. I took it into the kitchen and set it on the counter. I made myself a glass of iced tea and sat on the back porch, watching the shadows stretch across the lawn. I thought about the silent preparation my father had engaged in. He had spent months, maybe years, watching his children. He had seen the way Victoria treated the staff at the country club. He had seen the way she talked down to me when I was in the wheelchair. He hadn't fought her then. He hadn't argued. He had simply moved the chess pieces into a position where she could never win. I was doing the same thing. I wasn't going to call Victoria. I wasn't going to gloat. I was going to build a life so large and so meaningful that she wouldn't even be a footnote in it. I finally picked up the letter. I used a silver letter opener that had been my grandfather's. The paper was heavy, expensive. Sierra, it began. No, dear. No pleasantries. Just my name. We are staying at the hotel for another week. Derek is looking for a short-term rental in the city. I expect you to be reasonable about the personal items I left behind. The kids are asking why they can't go to Grandma's house. I hope you're happy with the wreckage you've caused. Wreckage. I looked out at the garden. The rose bushes were perfectly trimmed. The lawn was a deep, healthy green. The house was standing tall, its windows reflecting the gold of the sunset. There was no wreckage here. The only wreckage was the hollowed-out life Victoria had built on a foundation of expectations. I put the letter back in the envelope and tucked it into the drawer with the business card. It was a trophy. It was proof that the predator was now the petitioner. That night, I didn't go to my parents' room. I went to my old room. I sat at my drafting table and turned on the lamp. I pulled out a fresh sheet of vellum and a 2H pencil. I didn't think about the pain in my back. I didn't think about the cane leaning against the wall. I thought about the mill on the river. I thought about the way the light would hit the water if the glass was angled just right. I drew the first line. It was straight. It was certain. It was the beginning of a world that didn't need Victoria's permission to exist. I worked for hours. The house was silent, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the ghosts of the people who had loved me enough to give me this chance. I could almost hear my mother's voice telling me to keep going. I could almost feel my father's hand on my shoulder, a steady, guiding presence. I was 34 years old. I was a millionaire. I was a survivor. And for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the pen. I looked at the drawing. It was a park, a sanctuary, a place where things could grow even after they had been broken. It was a reflection of me. It was beautiful. I went to bed at 3 in the morning. I slept a deep, dreamless sleep. When I woke up on Tuesday, the house was still there. The money was still there. And I was still standing. I walked down the stairs, the rhythm of my cane a steady, comforting beat. I went into the kitchen and saw the ivory envelope on the counter. I didn't feel the flash of anger I expected. I felt nothing. She was just a woman in a hotel room, waiting for a life that was never coming back. I opened the back door and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, the dew still heavy on the grass. I took a deep breath, the scent of damp earth and pine filling my lungs. I was ready. The silent preparation was over. It was time to start building. The first 3 months of my new life passed in a rhythmic blur of sawdust, legal filings, and the sharp, clean smell of new blueprints. I had reopened the firm, but it was no longer Thompson and Associates. It was just Sierra. I didn't need the ghost of my father's name to carry the weight of my ambitions anymore, even if his legacy was the fuel that kept the engine running. I bought the old textile mill on the river, a sprawling, red brick monster that most people considered an eyesore. To me, it was a masterpiece of potential. I spent my mornings on the construction site, my cane clicking against the uneven concrete floors while the workers moved around me with a quiet, practiced efficiency. They didn't look at me with pity. They looked at me for instructions. I stood on the riverbank in late June, the heat of the sun pressing against my shoulders like a heavy hand. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and diesel from the excavators. I watched the water churn against the old stone foundations of the mill, a persistent, tireless force. It reminded me of the way I had to move now, slow, steady, and impossible to stop. My back was aching, a dull, thrumming reminder of the metal rods that held me together, but I didn't sit down. I wanted to feel the ground. Whenever the physical pain became a roar in my ears, I found myself thinking about a specific afternoon when I was 19. I had come home from my first year of architecture school with a scale model I had built for my final project. It was a library, all glass and light. I had spent 72 hours straight in the studio, my eyes bloodshot and my fingers scarred from X-Acto blade slips. I had been so proud of it. Victoria had walked into the kitchen while I was showing it to our parents. She didn't say it was beautiful. She didn't ask how I had made the tiny trees out of wire and moss. She just reached out and snapped the delicate balsa wood roof off the structure. "Oh, I thought that was a scrap piece," she had said, her voice light and airy as she dropped the broken wood into the trash. My father had looked at me with a pained expression, but he hadn't made her fix it. He hadn't made her apologize. I realized then that Victoria didn't just break things. She enjoyed the sound they made when they shattered. Now, I was the one building something she couldn't touch. Every brick we laid at the mill felt like a repair to that 19-year-old's heart. I wasn't just restoring a building. I was restoring myself. Sarah was my lead architect now, and we worked in a small, temporary office on the edge of the property. The walls were covered in sketches and material samples. We talked about light and shadows, about the way a space could breathe. In late July, the first cracks in Victoria's new life began to show, appearing not in my living room, but in the society pages of the Hartford Courant. There was a small blurb about Derek being restructured, out of his firm. It was a polite way of saying he had been fired. Without the Thompson family connection, without the promise of the inheritance he had been bragging about for years, he was just another mid-level executive with an expensive car and an even more expensive wife. I sat at my kitchen table, drinking a cup of herbal tea and read the article twice. I didn't feel the surge of joy I expected. I just felt a profound sense of inevitability. The money was gone for them. Victoria had spent the last decade living 3 steps ahead of her bank account, assuming that the final payout would cover the gaps. She had leased SUVs she couldn't afford and bought clothes that cost more than my first car. Now, she was trapped in a luxury rental with a husband who had no income and a reputation that was beginning to sour. I received a phone call from Derek in early August. I was in the middle of a site visit, the noise of the power saws making it hard to hear. I stepped out into the quiet of the loading dock to answer. "Sierra," he said. He sounded older. The confidence that usually dripped from his voice like oil was gone. "We're in a bit of a situation. Victoria. She's not doing well. I looked at my reflection in the glass of the office door. I looked composed. I looked like a woman who didn't care about his situations. "What do you want, Derek? We need a loan," he whispered. "Just to get through the next few months until I find something new." Victoria won't ask, but I'm asking. For the kids. I thought about Emma and Jack. I thought about the way they had run through my mother's house, leaving mud on the rugs. They were just children, caught in the crossfire of their parents' greed. But I also thought about the way Derek had looked at my cane during the will reading. I thought about the way he had helped Victoria pack my things into boxes before the legal papers were even cold. No, I said. "Sierra, come on. You have $28 million. 100,000 wouldn't even register on your balance sheet. It's not about the balance sheet, Derek," I said. "It's about the trust." My father was very clear. "The money is to be used for the preservation of the legacy and for my care. Loaning you money to pay for a lifestyle you can't afford doesn't fall under either category." He hung up without saying goodbye. I stood on the loading dock for a long time, the heat of the afternoon shimmering off the asphalt. I felt a fleeting moment of hesitation, a ghost of the girl who always wanted her sister's approval. But it vanished as quickly as it had come. I wasn't that girl anymore. By September, the mill was 50% complete. We had the roof on, and the windows were being installed. The local news had picked up the story, the comeback kid of the architecture world restoring a local landmark. They didn't mention the accident. They didn't mention the cane. They mentioned the design. They mentioned the vision. I was sitting in my mother's garden one evening, the air finally starting to cool as autumn approached. The roses were in their final bloom, the petals heavy and fragrant. I heard a car pull into the driveway. I didn't have to look to know who it was. The sound of the engine was familiar, even if it was a different, older car than the one she had been driving 3 months ago. Victoria walked around the side of the house. She wasn't wearing a designer dress today. She was wearing jeans and a simple white t-shirt. She looked tired. There were shadows under her eyes that no amount of makeup could hide. She didn't come onto the porch. She stood at the edge of the grass, her hands shoved into her pockets. "It's a nice garden," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the sharp edges she usually carried. I didn't get up. I just watched her. "Mom always liked it this time of year." Victoria nodded. She looked toward the woods, toward the spot where my fairy garden used to be. I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not regret exactly, but a recognition of loss. "Derek told me he called you," she said. "I told him not to. I know," I replied. "We're moving," Victoria said. "To a small place in the city, near the public school. It's different." I didn't say anything. I didn't offer her a seat. I didn't offer her coffee. The silence between us was like a physical wall, built stone by stone over 30 years of resentment and misunderstanding. I realized in that moment that I didn't hate her anymore. Hate requires energy. Hate requires a connection. I just felt nothing. "I'm sorry about the china," she said suddenly. I shouldn't have tried to take it. I looked at her, searching for a sign of sincerity. I saw a woman who was finally realizing that the world didn't owe her a living. I saw a woman who had been humbled by the very thing she worshipped, money. "I asked that your apology?" I asked. She looked at me, her jaw tightening. "It's all you're going to get, Sierra." I nodded. It was enough. It wasn't the public redemption I had imagined, but it was an admission of defeat. She had come to my house, the house she had tried to throw me out of, and she had stood on the grass and acknowledged her mistake. "Good luck with the move, Victoria," I said. She turned and walked back to her car. I watched the taillights disappear down the driveway. I sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the crickets and the rustle of the leaves. I felt a weight lift from my chest, a final, lingering piece of the past drifting away into the night. The injustice was over. The balance had been restored. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the architect of my own life. I stood up and walked toward the house. My back was stiff and my leg was heavy, but I didn't look down. I looked at the light in the windows. I looked at the home I had saved. I was Sierra Thompson. And I was finally free. The snow began to fall on the day the mill finally opened its doors to the public. It was a fine, powdery dusting that turned the red bricks into a frosted landscape, reflecting the gray winter light like a sheet of crushed diamonds. I stood in the central atrium, the glass ceiling soaring 60 feet above me, watching the flakes drift past as if they were silent witnesses to the stillness that had finally settled over my life. The air inside smelled of expensive floor wax, fresh pine from the decorative planters, and the faint, metallic tang of the river rushing beneath the foundations. People moved through the gallery spaces in hushed groups, their voices small and reverent in the face of the architecture. They did not see the metal rods in my spine. They did not see the 2 years I spent staring at the ceiling of a guest room. They only saw a masterpiece. My hand gripped the handle of my new cane, a sleek, modern design that felt more like a part of my body than a tool for survival. I moved with a slow, measured grace, a rhythm I had perfected through thousands of hours of agonizing repetition. I stopped by the great window overlooking the water. A young couple was standing there, their shoulders touching as they pointed at the churn of the current. They looked happy. They looked like they believed the world was a place that rewarded effort and kindness. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of memory, a jagged fragment of the past that cut through the triumph of the morning. I was 12, and I had spent the entire afternoon helping my father paint the garden shed. I was covered in green splatters, my hair a mess of tangled knots and drying pigment, but I felt useful. I felt like a partner in his work. Victoria had walked by in a pristine white sundress, holding a glass of iced tea like a prop in a play. She didn't offer to help. She didn't say the color was nice. She looked at my father and told him I was doing a terrible job, that the paint was uneven and that I was wasting his time. She told him he should have waited for her because she had an eye for detail. My father hadn't looked up from the wood. He just said, "Sierra is doing fine, Victoria. She's the one who's here." Victoria hadn't liked that answer. She waited until my father went inside to answer the phone, then she walked over and kicked the bucket of green paint. It tipped slowly, a thick, sluggish wave of emerald soaking into the grass and ruining my favorite sneakers. She told me it was an accident. She told me I shouldn't have left it where people walk. She had always been the architect of my failures. I looked at the couple by the window again. I realized that for the first time in my life, I didn't care about the paint on the grass. I didn't care about the sneakers. I had built the whole building, and Victoria wasn't even in the blueprints. The letter arrived 4 months after the will reading. It had been sitting on the mahogany sideboard in the foyer for 3 days before I found the courage to open it. I knew the handwriting immediately, the sharp, slanted loops of Victoria's pen that always looked like they were in a hurry to get somewhere else. There was no return address, just a postmark from the city. I took it into my father's study, the room that had become the heart of my daily life, and sat in the quiet. The house felt peaceful now. The ghosts were still there, but they were no longer restless. They were guests in a house that was being loved. I used a silver letter opener to slit the heavy ivory envelope. There was no formal greeting. No, dear Sierra. It was a message stripped of all the performance she had used for 30 years. "I've been thinking about what you said," she wrote. "I've been thinking about what I said, about all of it. I'm not ready to apologize in front of everyone. I don't know if I'll ever be ready, but I want you to know that I'm trying to understand why I became this person. And I'm sorry, even if I can't say it out loud yet. I'm sorry." I read the words 3 times. The paper felt heavy, as if the ink itself had weight. I looked for the catch. I looked for the hidden demand or the subtle manipulation that usually accompanied her words, but there was nothing there. It was just a confession. It was a white flag raised in the middle of a private, lifelong war. I didn't cry. My eyes were dry, but my throat felt tight, as if a hand were squeezing the windpipe. I thought about the Christmas photo where she tried to erase me. I thought about the cane. I thought about the words, "Find somewhere else to die." Those words would never truly go away. They were etched into the foundation of our relationship like a crack in a basement wall. But the letter was a patch. It was a beginning. I opened the top drawer of my father's desk. I placed the letter next to my mother's diary and the business card with the words "Call him. He knows everything." I felt a sense of closure that the $28 million hadn't been able to provide. It wasn't the public accountability I had once craved. It wasn't a scene in a courtroom or a headline in the paper. It was just two sisters, separated by a lifetime of hurt, finally acknowledging the damage. We weren't close after that. We probably never would be. We didn't have Sunday dinners or call each other to complain about our days. But we could be in the same room without pretending the other didn't exist. We could exchange birthday cards. We could talk about the children. We were building something new, something modest and fragile, but it was better than the wreckage we had left behind. I walked out onto the back porch of the family home as the sun began to set on the first anniversary of the will reading. The air was cold, but I didn't go back inside. I stood at the railing and looked out over the garden I had spent the last year restoring. The roses were dormant now, tucked under a blanket of mulch and snow, waiting for the cycle to begin again. I thought about the word useless. It had been thrown at me like a stone, intended to sink me to the bottom of the lake. Instead, I had used it as a stepping stone. I had been told to find somewhere else to die, and in doing so, I had finally learned how to live. My worth was no longer a calculation made by a sister who only valued what she could sell. My worth was in the stones of the mill, the flowers in the garden, and the steady, rhythmic beat of my own heart. I am Sierra Thompson. I was broken and I was discarded. But I am the one who stayed. I am the one who built. And I am finally, truly home. If my journey has taught you anything, I hope it is this. Your value is not a commodity to be traded. Your strength is not measured by the speed of your gait or the perfection of your posture. It is measured by the depth of your roots and the resilience of your spirit. Boundaries matter. They are the fences that protect the things we love from the people who would trample them. Sometimes, the person you are told is the weakest is the only one strong enough to hold the whole world together. I stood there until the stars came out, the cold biting at my cheeks and the silence of the woods wrapping around me like a blanket. I felt the house behind me, warm and full of light, a sanctuary I had earned through blood and patience. I turned and walked toward the door, my cane steady on the wood, the click-thud sounding like a countdown to a future I could finally see. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. I am home. I am whole. I am enough.